thank you so much for having me. Honored to be here today. Today I'm going to talk about my approach to teaching Machiavelli to business students specifically. So here's a rundown of what I want to try to accomplish today. So first, a quick overview of Cornerstone for Business and a little bit about my personal background. Not because I'm particularly interesting, but because the way I teach Machiavelli to business students kind of reflects my own personal odyssey through the academy. After that, I'm going to give an overview of the case method that we use in business ethics education because the way I teach Machiavelli is just an application of the case method in business ethics to Machiavelli. Then after that, apply a few a few examples of the case method to Machiavelli. So go through how I actually teach the text. Um, After that, some ideas for further extensions if you're interested in this method. This will be things I haven't done yet, but I would like to try in the future. So maybe you'll get there before me and give me some pointers on how that might work. And then obviously we'll end with a Q&A. So a little bit of overview about Cornerstone for Business. So all freshmen at Purdue take Cornerstone SCLA 101 and 102. And these courses are basically doing two different things. So first, and I think most importantly, they're great books courses. So 101 is from antiquity to roughly the 18th century. I think I teach 101 and I end with Adam Smith, so that sounds right to me. And then 102 would go from the 19th century until the present day. So first and foremost, they're great books classes, but more important, they're also skills classes as well. So in 101, what we're really trying to do is hammer on the writing skills. So in 101, they'll write three full papers, and then 102, you're going to work on the public speaking skills. I don't teach 102, so I don't know how many public speeches they have to give in 102, but it's from my colleagues who do teach it, it's quite a lot. So all freshmen at Purdue, they go through the sequence 101 and 102, both great books and both skills courses. Now, Purdue recently has introduced something called Cornerstone for Business, which is just SCLA 101B and SCLA 102B. And like the other two courses, these are both great books and they're skills courses. So the only difference between these courses here is they're for business students specifically. So in my 101 class, it's all 30 students will be from the B school, and the readings will be tailored for business students specifically. So the way normal Cornerstone works is Melinda Zook has curated this wonderful selection of texts that instructors can choose from. But for Cornerstone for Business, it's a little more restricted. It's a little more circumscribed what we can choose from. And the texts are supposed to be those great books that are going to be particularly interesting for business students. So obviously, Adam Smith is going to be on there. Hayek, Schumpeter, Keynes, Locke, and Machiavelli is on there as well. So a little bit about me, and again, not because I'm particularly interesting, but just because this is kind of how informs how I teach these texts. So I got my PhD in philosophy at the University of Arizona in 2017. My first job was in a philosophy department at the University of Maryland, teaching in PPE. We made a big philosophy, politics, and economics major there. And then I kind of got a little stir crazy and decided to take a job in a business school at West Virginia University, and I was there for a few years. And there I was mostly teaching business ethics and leadership and management ethics. And actually, like it's a pretty big cultural difference going from a liberal arts college to a business school. Like culturally, it's different. I got yelled at for not wearing polo shirts and like not dressing up enough when I teach. I wore a polo shirt today to not get yelled at. But also the teaching style is really different. So the way they do even software classes like business ethics is very different. I'll talk about that soon. And then after WVU, I decided to come to Purdue, where now I mostly teach in Cornerstone. So kind of the relevant part here is I was coming from a business school. I was asked to teach great books, which I didn't have a ton of familiarity with. I did like one course in the history of economic thought, which I really loved, but great books like wasn't my thing, right? But I was also going to teach great books in a business school, which kind of sounded a little weird, but I trusted Melinda on it. And so I was also really stressed. I was working on a lot of papers. I was applying for grants. So I was like, how do I do this as easily as I can? And my thought process was, why not teach the great books as I would teach a business management ethics class? I just spent a few years like mastering that skill set. So why don't I try to apply it over here and let's see what happens? What's the worst that could happen? And so so now I want to talk a little bit about how we teach business ethics in a business school, and then I'm going to show how we would apply this to Machiavelli or perhaps other authors in the canon. So in business schools, ethics and leadership is usually taught by working through actual cases that require students to apply the principles that they learn in class. And so actually, like if you go on Amazon and just type in like business ethics case method, you can buy thick books that are nothing but actual cases that you can have your students read to discuss. So it'll be, a case would be like the Ford Pinto case. I think from the 90s where Ford realized there was a problem with the braking system, but they also realized that it would be cheaper to pay for wrongful death lawsuits than it would be to actually recall and fix all the vehicles. So that would be one case in there. Or like Enron always figures into these case books. Purdue Pharma selling OxyContin, Dow chemical spills, all these kinds of things. Right. So the idea is we're going to teach ethics by working through actual cases. And there's a lot of ways to do it, but my preferred method works something like this. So first you introduce the case. That's how you would start the class, by giving like a real world case and sort of having a broad class discussion about it. You pump the intuitions. If you know how to work a room, you can milk 20 minutes pretty easily, just kind of going back and forth what students think about the case. Then from there, you go into lecture, you introduce the relevant moral principle that you want to teach. Then after that, you return to the case. What does the principal say about the case? And then after that, do a general discussion of the principle. So again, this is pretty common in business schools. It's actually a really great way to teach. And what I want to do is run through a quick example of how this works for like a typical business ethics class, and then apply it to Machiavelli. So suppose we wanted to teach our students about shareholder and stakeholder theories of the firm. And so we might start class with some cases, right? So case one, and again, you would use real cases for this, but this is just kind of examples we're doing, right? So case one, finance says you can increase profits by 10% by assigning more work to current employees, requiring they work 50 rather than 40 hours a week. As a manager, what should you do? Then case two, finance says you can increase profits by 30% by moving a factory in Flint, Michigan to Mexico. This will have a negative impact on current employees and the broader Flint community. What should you do? And actually, that's kind of mirroring the real case of all the auto industries in the Detroit area who made the decision to outsource in the 80s and 90s. And again, you would probably want to use real cases if you did this, but from you start the class like this. This would be the first slide of a class. And again, you can do about 20 minutes just going back and forth. What do the students think? Were they in these roles? What would they do? And so after that, you kind of go into a general discussion of the relevant content. And so for this example, we're teaching our students about the shareholder and stakeholder theories of the firm. So the shareholder theory of the firm, you read Uncle Milty. The social responsibility of business is to maximize profits. The shareholder theory says that you need to maximize shareholder wealth. You need to only focus on profits. Versus the stakeholder theory of the firm says that no, you shouldn't care only about the shareholders. You should also care about your employees, the broader community, and so on and so forth. So you do 15, 20 minutes of lecturing on that. Then step three is you go back to the cases and you apply the theory you just did. So we go back to case one, we say, what would the shareholder theory say? What would the stakeholder theory say? And the students will say, the shareholder theory says you should make your employees work more. The stakeholder theory says, it's a little bit more complicated. You don't care only about profits, you also care about your employees. And then in case two, you say, okay, what did the theory say? The shareholder theory says you should outsource to Mexico. The stakeholder theory says it's a little more complicated. You got to care about the community and the employees and so on and so forth. And then from there, you end the class with sort of like a general discussion of the principles. So like now that we know what these principles are, now that we see how they apply to real life cases, like which is a plausible management style going forward. And then you kind of end the class here. Some students will defend the shareholder theory. Some students will defend the stakeholder theory, and so on and so on. So that's an example of how we would do like the business ethics case method for a pretty typical Pretty typical content you would have in a B school class, again, shareholder and stakeholder theories of the firm. And so why is this a good method to use? The most important one is that it's actually a lot of fun, right? So I like doing case-based classes. The students get really into it. You generate really great discussion and really great debate. Business school deans like experiential learning. I'm not sure I know what experiential learning is, but sometimes they count this as that, so that can get you some points there. But I mean, the real reason you want to kind of teach ethics from cases in a B school is that the students in business schools are extraordinarily practical. It's not meant to be an insult at all. They're really great. They're really great students, but um, for them to get excited about something, they need to know how it's going to benefit their lives. Like now, they need to know how it's going to benefit their career. There's no tolerance for like abstract discussion. You can't start with like Bentham's principle of utility. They'll say like, "What the heck is this? Why are we doing this?" But if you start with a case like, "No, this is something that like the executives at Ford had to deal with. This is something that the executives at Enron or Purdue Pharma had to deal with." That kind of it works a little bit better to get the business students engaged, and so that's why I think it's a great method. And I think you can use it to perhaps teach some of the greats in the canon, particularly for Machiavelli. After all, The Prince was intended to be a guide for leadership, right? So Machiavelli, I'm not a scholar of Machiavelli in any respect, but he's out of power. He's trying to get back in power. He writes The Prince as a guide to leadership for the Medicis. And so I think you can profitably read it in that light. And so, given that, let me walk through an example or two of how we might use the case method in business ethics to get students to think about specific passages from Machiavelli. So here's a case I use in my Cornerstone for Business class. So you're the chief compliance officer at a firm. Currently, the firm is not complying with EPA regulations, but you're reasonably sure you're not going to get caught. You also don't think the regulation provides any meaningful protection to the environment. So this is not a case of like spewing toxic chemicals into a river, right? The regulatory code in the US is like 18,000 pages long. Presumably some of them aren't that important. So we're working with like a relatively unimportant one in this case. To bring the firm into compliance will cost millions. Moreover, you also know your competition knowingly does not comply with EPA regulations, and you are reasonably sure they will not get caught. Should you bring the firm into compliance? And so you start the class with just like a 20-minute discussion on this. In my experience, the students are going to be pretty split. So half of them are going to say, like, of course you should bring your firm into compliance. Half of them are going to say, like, of course not. Like, why would you do that? And again, like, as a professor of ethics, I do think this is an interesting ethical dilemma. So long as we stipulate that the regulation is relatively minor, and also, if we stipulate that your competition isn't playing by the rules either, it's not clear, it's not obvious to me what the right thing to do in this case is. And I think if you use a case like this, you'll see that reflected in the general class discussion. Okay, so we do about 20 minutes on that. And then what we want to do is go into the Machiavelli. And so here's a passage that I think was handed out prior to the talk today from the Prince. Machiavelli writes this. Everyone realizes how praiseworthy it is for a prince to honor his word and to be straightforward rather than crafty in his dealings. Nonetheless, contemporary experience shows that princes who have achieved great things have been those who have given their word lightly, who have known how to trick men with their cunning, and who, in the end, have overcome those abiding by honest principles. So a pretty straightforward reading here is Machiavelli just saying like, okay, go ahead and lie. Why not, right? But I actually think it's a little more complicated. And so we go to the next passage, right? And hold on here. So here he writes, so it follows that a prudent ruler cannot and must not honor his word when it places him at a disadvantage and when the reasons for which he made his promise no longer exist. And this is the key sentence here. If all men were good, right, this precept would not be good. But because men are wretched creatures who would not keep their word to you, you need not keep your word to them. So the way I read this here is Machiavelli suggesting like a kind of reciprocity, right? I mean, like, I don't know what Machiavelli was actually saying, and I'm not a Machiavelli scholar, but as I read these passages, the simple reading is like Machiavelli just says you should lie, and that's okay. I don't think that's right. I think he's saying in an environment where dishonesty is the norm, it's permissible for you to lie. But in an environment in which other men were good, so in an environment where honesty were the norm, then it's impermissible for you to lie. So lying is sort of context dependent on your environment. That's how I at least read these passages. So we go through the case, we walk through these passages. I put the passages up on the screen. I make the students bring their books. They got to open their books. I make them tell me what Machiavelli's trying to say, right? I don't actually want to teach it, right? You tell me what he's saying. And so we go through that, and then we go back to our cases. Right, so we go back to the case. I'm not going to read it again. And we ask WWMD, right, what would Machiavelli do? And I think in this case, it's pretty clear Machiavelli would say, well, of course it's okay to be dishonest. Of course it's okay to not comply with the EPA regulation because you know that the other firm is not complying as well. Now, at this point, what you want to do is you want to introduce a little twist on the case just to make sure students understand the actual nuance that Machiavelli brings. Because again, I don't think it's right to read him as saying like it's permissible to lie always. I think he's saying lying is context dependent on your environment. And so here's like a slight variation of the case, and the new part is in red. Okay. So your chief compliance officer at a firm. Currently, the firm is not complying with EPA regulations, but you're reasonably sure you won't get caught. You also don't think the regulation provides any meaningful protection to the environment. To bring the firm into compliance will cost millions. Moreover, you know your competition does comply with EPA regulations, and we can even add more. And they have a history of always faithfully complying with EPA regulations. Should you bring the firm into compliance? And then we asked WWMD, what would Machiavelli do? And I think it's not very clear what Machiavelli would do, but I think that's actually kind of the point, and that's kind of good. And so then this is the part where you can get the students to go back to the passage. Again, he says, well, if all men were good, this would be a bad maxim, but when they're wretched, it's a good maxim, right? And so there's going to be a split in the class here, and half the students are going to say, well, no, Machiavelli would probably say, in this case, you should be honest because you're dealing with people who are good to you. And some people might say, no, Machiavelli would still say you should lie. It's permissible to lie. And again, I don't know what Machiavelli went, but if I can get the kids to fight with each other for 20 minutes about what Machiavelli said, then I think that I take that as a win, right? And so you twist the cases a little bit just to make sure they understand the nuance in the passage, and then you end class is with just a discussion of the principle. Is Machiavelli correct that you should lie when you are reasonably sure others will lie to you first? And when I've done this before, historically, I'll get a split among the students. About half will say yes, half will say no. And anytime you get that kind of debate in a great books class, I think you're doing your job. I think that's exactly where you want to be. So that's one example, and I want to do another example of how we might teach some passages from Machiavelli, and then sort of a general discussion of this method and some extensions. All right, so here's a new case. You are CEO and your company is struggling. Next year will be even worse, given high interest rates, tariff uncertainty, and increasing competition from rival firms. Your team seems distracted. They show up late, they leave early, and disregard instructions. It is the end of the fiscal year. You have two options for motivating them, and only two options. The kids don't like it when you force them into two options, so you gotta be firm on that. One, you can give them a significant bonus, or two, you can fire the bottom 10%, which is actually not uncommon practice in the corporate world, right? So Amazon used to pretty famously fire the bottom 10% of its workforce. I think it's less common these days, but there's a lot of firms, specifically in the 90s, it's a specific management style where every year you get rid of the bottom 10% as a motivating factor. So what should you do? Should you give them the bonus or should you fire the bottom 10%? And again, when I give this case in class, students are pretty split. About half will say, well, of course you fire the bottom 10%. About half will say, no, the bonus is going to be more motivating. It's going to get them to work harder. They'll be dispirited if you fire the bottom 10%. And so you go back and forth for about 20 minutes discussing that case. And then you dive into Machiavelli. Same things. You get the text on the screen, tell them to get their books out and read along. And so this is the relevant passage. Machiavelli writes, "From this arises the following question: whether it is better to be loved than feared, or the reverse. The answer is that one would like to be both, the one and the other. But because it is difficult to combine them, it's far better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both, right? So as a general management style, do you want to have your employees fear you or love you? Well, obviously we want both, but we can't have both in the real world. So if you have to pick one, Machiavelli says you choose fear. Okay, why does he think that? He writes this: men worry less about doing an injury to one who makes himself loved than to one who makes himself feared. For love is secured by a bond of gratitude which men, wretched creatures that they are, break when it is to their advantage to do so. But fear is strengthened by a dread of punishment, which is always effective. So the idea here is if you have to choose between love or fear with your subordinates, you want to use fear because love depends on loyalty and you can't really trust loyalty, right? If you're trying to use love to motivate your employees, you're trying to win them over, and you might win them over when times are good, but whenever it's convenient for them, they'll sort of turn their back on you, right? And they'll stab you in the back. So because men are wretched creatures like that, it's best to use fear rather than love. Okay. Interesting managerial style. And so then we go back to the case after, we again, make them explain the Machiavelli to you, don't explain it to them, right? And then so we go back to the case, WWMD, what would Machiavelli do? And I think pretty clearly in this case, he's going to say, well, of course, you fire the bottom 10%. Fear works better than love. If you try to win them over with the bonus, maybe they'll be excited to work for you for the next couple months, but eventually when times get hard, they'll go back on their word and they won't continue performing well. And again, this is the part where you alter the cases just to make sure you kind of understand the nuance and actually what Machiavelli's saying. So here's a variation of the case. Red marks the change. You're a CEO and your company is struggling. Next year will be even worse. Given high interest rates, tariff uncertainty, and increasing competition from rival firms, your team generally works very hard. They show and have shown in the past loyalty to you. And we can even go further. We can say for the last 10 years, your team has been loyal to you. You have two options to motivate them this coming fiscal year. You can give them a significant bonus, or you can fire the bottom 10%. What do you do as a manager? Then we say, okay, WWMD, what would Machiavelli do? And here I think it's kind of interesting what he would do. Again, I think a simple reading says, well, of course, you always just want to be feared, so just fire the bottom 10%. But again, he says, you want to be feared because you can't depend on loyalty. Well, what if you could depend on loyalty? What if we were working with people who we know have been loyal to us in the past and we have very good reason to believe will be loyal to us in the future? Then it's plausible that Machiavelli would say, well, do the bonus, don't do the firing. And again, look, I have no idea what Machiavelli would actually say. That's not really the point. The point is, if I can get them to fight with each other for 20 minutes, right, about pointing to the text and saying, well, no, think about this. Machiavelli would do this in this case. That's a win, right? And so I'm not, this is not exegetical. Not trying to get the heart of what he's saying, but if I can get them applying the text and thinking about it and fighting with each other about it, I take that as a win. And then we end class, as always, with a discussion of the principle. Is Machiavelli correct that you should rely on fear rather than love when you question your subordinate's loyalty? And again, I think you'll see about a 50-50 split on this, and you kind of end class with a discussion. And of course, this is the right answer for what you should do from Michael Scott from The Office. Would I rather be feared or loved? Both. I want people to be afraid of how much they love me. But the kids are too young and they never watch The Office. They're too young for that. Okay, so that's some examples of how I have applied the business ethics method to Machiavelli. Now I want to talk about some things I haven't done, but could, I think, profitably done. So does this just work with Machiavelli? No, I think it would work with a lot of different thinkers. In particular, any of the Roman, Renaissance era Republican thinkers. People like Marcus Aurelius, Plutarch, Cicero, Seneca, Polybius. So I'm by no means a scholar of this tradition, but I've read most of them. And what's interesting about this tradition is, in comparison to like liberal thinkers, that's who I specialize in, like post-Hobbesian liberal thinkers, they think all men are bad. And so they're about how do we design institutions to channel the badness into good outcomes. That's Smith's invisible hand. Yeah, that's Madison and Federalist 51 or whatever it is. But all these Roman Renaissance era Republican thinkers, they're obsessed with good leadership. They're obsessed with what makes a good leader. They're less concerned about institutions, they're more concerned about the qualities of a good and virtuous leader. And so that's all over Cicero, it's all over Polybius, it's all over Seneca. I think you could teach like a whole class on leadership and managerial ethics just based on great books. It would be a lot of work to do, it'll be a lot of work to prepare, but it's something I am interested in doing in the future. And more generally, if you spend too much time on LinkedIn, one thing you'll notice is that in the business community, outside of academia in general, there's actually huge interest in like these Roman Renaissance Republican era thinkers. Right. So here's some examples of best-selling books, right? The Daily Stoic, 366 Meditations on Wisdom, Perseverance, and the Art of Living, How to Be a Great Leader, which is really just a curated selection of Plutarch, The Stoic Capitalist, Advice for the Exceptionally Ambitious. And so, like, I mean, one thing I've kind of come to realize over the past couple of years, going back and forth between like business schools and liberal arts departments, is that there's actually a real hunger for what we know and what we teach, but you have to present it in the right way and you have to meet them where they are. So like, again, if you're with business students, you just start with a lecture on Cicero and like, well, here's a little background about Cicero and the context and things, right? The eyes are just going to glaze over, right? But like when you package, okay, what would Cicero or Plutarch or whoever say about managing a firm? There's actually a huge amount of demand for that, and I think we could all be a little bit more relevant if we knew how to package ourselves better. In fact, I mean, this is off topic, and my next slide is my last slide, so I'll ramble for a bit. There's this really huge podcast that AI Silicon Valley types listen to. It's called the Dwarkash Podcast. And I was listening to it the other day. And his most recent guest is a Renaissance historian from the University of Chicago. And this woman's brilliant, right? And he interviewed her for like 3 hours. And like the whole time it was him asking kind of weird questions about like what you can learn about AI and technological development from the Renaissance. It was like kind of corny, right? But she was like super patient and like she was a great guest. And it was like really good. It was really interesting. And again, like I think there's a hunger for some of this knowledge we have in like the broader business world and business community if we know how to package it and present it in the right kind of way. Um, so yeah, final point. So last time I taught STLA 101B, this is the pedagogical style I used, but I didn't. The assignments didn't reflect that. So the assignments were just 3 papers, which is kind of boring. And so next time I teach the class, I want the writing assignments to use the case method as well. And here's a quick slide on how to do that, and then I promise I'm going to stop. So this is an assignment I would use in the business school at West Virginia University. I call it the Ethical Leadership Project. And here was the basic idea behind it. I broke students in groups of 5 because it was a big class and I didn't want to do a lot of grading. So like 45 kids, right? So I had like 9 groups, right? And so this assignment lasted the whole semester, right? And so the first couple of weeks, you make them start a mock business that does good in the world. What that means is up to them to define and defend. They have to create a mission statement, a statement of viability, all this kind of stuff, right? And then so over the course of the semester, you kind of turn it into like a role-playing game. So I would give students custom ethical dilemmas, and then they would have to tell me how they would respond to the ethical dilemmas using the works from class. And so oh, you learned that somewhere in your supply chain, you're relying on labor from Bangladesh at a factory that has subpar working conditions. There was recently a fire in the factory. 110 people died in the fire because the working conditions were so poor, and now it's all over Twitter. What should you do? Use 3 readings from the class to justify your answer. That's actually not that easy for ChatGPT to do, by the way, right? So that's a bonus for it. But so you can turn it into this like long role playing experience where you give them custom ethical dilemmas and then tell me how you're going to respond with the readings from the class. And they get kind of into it, right? There's one group that was kind of annoying me, so I made them testify in front of Congress. And I put like a table up at the front of the room. They all wore suits, and I let all the other students be senators. It was a lot of fun. But I think you could do the same thing with Machiavelli and some of these other authors as well. Because again, I think a lot of the people in the canon, they're actually writing about leadership, right? What it means to be a good and virtuous leader. And so you could imagine running a class like this where students role play a business or a nonprofit, or they role play a politician trying to get a policy passed. And then you give them custom dilemmas that they confront, and then they have to tell you how they're going to respond with a reliance on the readings from class. All right, I will stop there. Apologies for talking longer than I should have, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. Thank you.
Brian, thank you so much for this really exhilarating set of remarks. You know, you made me, I was thinking to myself, this is proof that liberal education is actually alive and well, and
It is absolutely.
in places where most people might not think to look for it. I mean, what you did so well in these remarks, and what you obviously do in your class is, for one thing, you show these students that the answers are not simple or
Mhm.
straightforward. Even trying to understand what the author of the text would do is not simple and straightforward. And it does, you know, I often think that if there's nothing else we do for our students beyond complicating the questions for them, that's a lot. So I really appreciate what you've just done for us, and particularly struck also by your remark, which was implicit in everything you said. We have to meet the students where they are, right?
Absolutely.
We can't expect them to walk into the room with an intrinsic interest in the history of this or the history of that. We have to show them why they might be interested because these texts speak to issues in their own lives. And so I'm not going to go on and on, but I just
Well,
want to.
just I mean, just one remark about that, if I may.
Sure. Yeah.
Again, like there's this weird world that a lot of us don't know, but like the number of like business podcasts that are talking about Marcus Aurelius is like insane, right? And like it would behoove all of us to listen to some of them and to go buy some of these books that are a little corny. Yeah, like the Stoic Capitalist. It's corny, but like it's plugging into something. And if like we can do a more serious version of that for students in a business school, that's good for us and it's good for them,
Yeah,
right?
no, I hear what you're saying, and I confess I'm not a big podcast listener, but I might give it a shot based on what you just said. But I think the general point um, that one might derive from what you're saying is that actually out there beyond the university, there is a real interest in what the literary and philosophical tradition has to offer for people trying to make their way through the real world. It's
Absolutely.
the problem we have in the university is that that news hasn't gotten to us, and that we're the ones that are supposed to be bringing these texts alive, but in fact, other people are doing it for us. So we ought to get in on that. But anyway, thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to Lonnie to curate what I hope will be some questions, and we really appreciate this. I think that you run the risk of our asking you to come back again. Right.
Anytime, happy to do so.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, Brian, there are just some questions about what edition of the prints that you use, which I believe is the Penguin Classics
Yes.
version that was reissued in 2013. If
Yeah.
you take a look at the link to the excerpts from this book, you'll see the publication information in the PDF. And then, Brian, a question about the name of the podcast that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And then sort of a question that takes us back to the case study example that you were walking us through, right? This question of like, like, am I honest because it pays to be honest? Because people around me are honest? Because there's an intrinsic value to being honest. So, a very practical question. Um, how do you talk to students about, in the example of customer service, when you're making sales to customers, wouldn't you want to be honest for your own, um, out of your own self-interest because you want repeat customers?
Mhm.
So what are ways that you parse that?
Yeah,
And
so
back to the text.
right. So yeah, Penguin Edition for the text. For the podcast, it's actually like one of the top five podcasts in the world. It's Dwarkesh. That's the guy's name. Dwarkesh. And this guy's one of these really AI. He's really into AI. He's a kid. He's really into AI stuff. But sometimes he brings on historians and liberal arts professors just out of it. So like he just had a Renaissance history professor at U Chicago. He had the guy on who did the big biography of Stalin, and he has these like sprawling 4 hour conversations about history stuff. And it's interesting. Like what he finds interesting in the history is different from what they find interesting. But again, it's interesting to get a sense of how the stuff is playing out in the broader world. And then in terms of the question about honesty, again, I'm not a Machiavelli scholar. On my reading, I think Machiavelli is giving like a reciprocity based theory of honesty. Like so it's not necessarily a self interest theory, but you owe it to be honest to other people if and only if you're reasonably sure they've been honest to you and will be honest to you going forward. But there's other views on like why be honest. And so that's why when you do this thing, you don't just want to do it with Machiavelli. So like what immediately comes to mind with that question is the Ring of Gyges from the Republic, right? If you had the ring of, it's been a while since I've read that stuff, but the ring of, Glaucon asks if you had the Ring of Gyges, right? Why wouldn't you just do whatever you wanted to do? Why be good? And I think Plato goes through in that part, Plato goes through like a couple different answers of like, well, you might be good for this reason, you might be good for this reason. And I think the answer Plato ends up coming to, and again, it's been a while since I read this text, is that it's just intrinsically good to be honest. And so that's why, if we're doing this method over several weeks, we can come back to the same cases, right? Okay, let's go back to this case that we did a couple weeks ago. This is what Machiavelli said, and oh, I remember what all you guys said. Now, after we do the Ring of Gyges from Plato, okay, well, what would Glaucon say? What would Plato say? What would Socrates say? And now we get these different answers, and that just makes the discussion at the end. And so we can always complicate it, right? So now when we come back to the case, it's what would Machiavelli do? What would Glaucon do? What would Socrates do? Right. And the answer is, I'm not here to give them the right answer on anything. That's not my job. I don't know the right answer on anything, right? I'm just kind of giving them the options and like forcing them to think through it, always kind of grounded in the text at first.
Okay, Brian, if I may, on this question that Lonnie sort of
Yeah.
opened up for us. I mean, as you, I think, just suggested, you read Machiavelli and you come away with the conclusion, right or wrong, that the choices he poses, should you be generous or should you be cruel, right? Should you work on being loved or should you work on being feared? The the context in which he asks those questions is always the context of how do you get the job done, right?
Hmm.
What's the better choice for your nation or your state or your city state to prosper, or in this case, your company to prosper? And that's been your emphasis, and I get that. I'm wondering whether your students, any of your students, given, we're told that we live in a society where religion remains really important. Do any of your students say, well, Christianity teaches you're supposed to do unto others as you would do
Hmm.
unto yourself. So the obvious answer here is to give everybody a bonus and not to fire the bottom 10%. In other
Yeah.
words, do you get pushback from students who bring a different perspective into the
Oh
discussion?
yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's really what that's the point of step 4 in the process, right? So step 3 is what would Machiavelli say about these cases? And again, I think it's more complicated than people realize. But then step 4 is okay, is Machiavelli right? Is another way to ask the question. And tons of pushback. There's no author we read that gets universal agreement. Machiavelli probably gets more pushback than anyone else. Now it's interesting. I don't have students bring up religious perspectives frequently in class. I don't know why that's true. But some of those ideas, like ideas based on like Christian ethics, will come through and say like, well, I don't care what Machiavelli says. Of course you ought not do that. Like, of course you shouldn't do that. Like, of course it's like, okay, good. Like again, I don't think Machiavelli's right. I don't think Machiavelli's wrong. I'm giving you one smart guy what he thought. It's your prerogative to agree or disagree with him, but you better be able to do so grounded in the text and the arguments. And so, absolutely, and that's how we end every class. We end every class of okay, we know we have a case. We know what the smart person said about the case. Now it's time for you. What do you say about the case? And you can agree with the smart person. You can disagree with the smart person. I don't care, but I need an argument. I need an argument from it. And if he's wrong, I need to know why he's wrong. Right. And so, yeah, absolutely disagree. Tons of it. Absolutely. Yeah.
And one last question for me, and then I'll shut up. Do you get a sense? I know you haven't been teaching this course for that many years, but do you get a sense at the end of the course that the students are going into their business career changed? Are they different from when they walked in the door of your class?
More thoughtful. They're better arguers. They're more careful in their argument. Like so, like there's questions of have their substantive views changed? I have no idea, and I'm actually kind of convinced that when they walk in, they don't have strong substantive views on anything because I don't think anyone's ever asked them the question,
Right.
right? So like, I think they're like agnostic about most things. But what you can really see is through the writing, because I do the 101 where it's 3 papers, and it's like the first paper is terrible. I mean, they don't even know what an argument is, right? I say an argument's a reason, an argument's a because. I think this because, right? And so I think when you kind of do this method, it's very Socratic method of okay, here's the case. Well, and I cold call on people just to really get in their faces. I'll say, Andrew, what do you think about the case? You say, well, I would do the 10%. Why do you think that? Well, okay, you kind of, and I think their ability to justify whatever views they have increases significantly. And I measure that between the first paper and the final paper. That like in the final paper is like, oh, like you can. It's one of the things we say. One of the things they say in business schools in like business ethics curriculum. This is like kind of weird. Is they say, we're here to tell you what to do if you find yourself in front of Congress. If you find yourself in, like as a part of like a congressional subpoena. Um, and like so you kind of got you it's aggressive. You get in their face. What would you do in this case? No, why would you do that? Well, what if that happened? And I think their ability to answer that role, fulfill that role, increases markedly over the semester. Yeah.
I believe it. Thank you. Lonnie, back to you.
Yes. Okay. So one question that I see in the Q&A has to do with how do you navigate challenges when you're teaching a course like business ethics in a school of business where you have colleagues who are trained in a positivist paradigm and you're trying to do something a little bit different? I mean, do you find sort of these cultural norms can get in the way of teaching the course the way you want to teach? I mean, maybe this is not particular to the institutional culture of your current institution, but perhaps it's something you've observed in other contexts.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. So I mean, I'm currently not in a business school. I'm in a liberal arts college where I teach to business students. So that's different there. In terms of being in a business school, it's really challenging as a philosopher. So I didn't go up for tenure in a business school. I ended up leaving before I got tenure, and I went up for tenure at Purdue here. But I was really nervous the whole time about there's just so much. it's like I was in a department with like supply chain professors, marketing professors. Like, I don't know what they do. They don't know what I do. And so that is really challenging. Um, and so, I mean, I don't know if I have any concrete advice in terms of how to navigate it, except be a nice guy and get coffee with people a lot, and just they kind of like warm up to you a little bit. But yeah, I'm kind of racking my brains here, like how do you navigate it? But it is difficult to be in a place where you're the minority, and they're like, what's the point of business ethics? What is that kind of thing? And you just kind of got to work on it, and don't give up things you shouldn't give up, but be accommodative and all that kind of stuff, and keep an open mind. And like you should keep an open mind because like I said, like the way I teach radically changed when I went from University of Maryland, where I was in the arts and humanities, to a business school, and like I was like kind of resistant to it. It's like I know how to teach. Like I don't want to listen to you. But like there was an older guy there who had taught business ethics there for like 30 years, and like I kind of used his materials begrudgingly at first. I was like, I don't know what this is. And I was like, oh, this is actually kind of good. This is actually kind of fun. Obviously, I changed some things from what he did, but I mean, it can be really difficult and challenging, but you should keep an open mind because they actually do some things pretty well in business schools, and they could learn a lot from us, and we could probably learn just as much from them too. But keep an open mind is the only thing I can come up with. Sorry about that.
So this is something, Brian, that you've already mentioned. Other texts that you use, connecting cases, not just to Machiavelli, but to other texts that the students are reading in your course.
Yeah.
How do you, so maybe just walk us through how, not just how you draw the connections between texts through the cases, um, but what are other strategies that you use to help students compare, contrast, build on ideas, and see the connections between different texts?
Um,
Right? I mean, Plato and Machiavelli, completely different eras.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, the two big ones are coming back to the same cases over and over again. If you can shoehorn, I mean, don't use it inappropriately where it ought not be used. But again, like a lot of these greats are hitting on similar themes, right? And so to the extent that you can't, so like we did do that I mean, that was a big, so the last time I taught SCLA 101B, it was Plato's Republic, Sir Thomas More, Machiavelli, Locke, Hobbes, Smith, and then I broke Melinda's rules and I added some human. So don't tell. I just love David Hume. So I don't tell her I did that though. And so there's some themes that are constant across those. One of them is like the role of self-interest, right? And so like I mean, so you kind of need like some foresight with like familiarity and foresight going through. But like again, Plato, Ring of Gyges is huge. Sir Thomas More, maybe not so much. Machiavelli, self-interest is used. Hobbes is the theorist of self-interest. There's some stuff in there, and then Adam Smith too. So like again, like coming back to these same cases, and then it gets really fun. It's like, okay, remember this one from 5 weeks ago? All right, this is what Plato would do. Okay, but now we're gonna see what Machiavelli would do. Now we're gonna see what Hobbes will do. Because like that dilemma of should you be honest or not? That's the Ring of Gyges. It's also Hobbes's Fool, right? And was it that's like chapter 14 or chapter 15 of Leviathan, right? And so it can just be the same thing but different. And then the other thing that keeps the business school students engaged is just basing everything off of current events, right? And so like I had the mother of all blessings the last time I taught it. Donald Trump won the election, and Donald Trump loves tariffs. Man, does he love tariffs. And Adam Smith hates tariffs, and David Hume hates tariffs. And so that's another way of like, okay. I mean, I remember like I actually couldn't believe it. It's like we did the tariff, we did Adam Smith, we did book four, chapter two of The Wealth of Nations the morning after Trump won. I think my first fall at Purdue. I was like, all right, this is what he ran on. Is it good? Is it a good policy? He goes, oh, of course. No, of course it's good. Okay. Well, let's see what Smith says. Okay. Let's go back to, is it a good policy? Well, it's a little more complicated now. Okay, let's end. All right, let's end class with tariffs, good or bad, right? And so those are the two ones. If you come back to same cases, and if you can tie it to current events, I think the business students are just more likely to be engaged with the class.
Right. Well, I think you've just left us with a lot of ideas, Brian,
Oh, well,
and new things to read and new things to listen to. The Dwarkish podcast that you mentioned, more than one person has told me about it, and maybe it's about time that
like I said, it's like
I try
I
it
mean,
out.
it's very Silicon Valley speak, and
Mhm.
there's a to it, but like again, it's a young person in a world that's not ours who sometimes engages with people in our world to great success, right? I think I read that some of his most popular shows are with historians,
Hmm.
and he interviews like tech CEOs, right? And so it's like, well, that's interesting. Something's going right there. We should try to figure out what is going right there so we can bring that into our
Mhm.
doctrines and our universities and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Uh, let me reiterate my thanks to you, Brian. I do one last question because we got a couple of minutes. These students in the business school, presumably, do they have any leeway in their schedule to take another course in which they could read texts like these?
Absolutely.
And do you feel that after I would guess that after taking this course from you, their appetite for more has been stimulated,
Yeah, so there's two avenues at Purdue. So one is we have the Cornerstone certificate,
right?
which is Cornerstone, you take the two, but if you take another three, you get the certificate. And my understanding is the Cornerstone certificate is the second largest certificate on campus. And I think a lot of that's just being driven there. We're also creating a new, it's in the works, it's not official yet. We're creating a new philosophy, politics, economics major at Purdue.
Ah,
Um, one thing Purdue does, which is one of the smartest things it does, is it has something called Degree Plus, where if you take a second major outside of your college, you don't have to take the general education requirements of that college. So if you were a B school student who wanted to take a PPE as a second major, if you want to do like finance and PPE, then you wouldn't have to take the College of Liberal Arts general education requirements. You would only have to take the PPE major requirements. So I think we get a lot of double majors just in liberal arts because Cornerstone is so great. And like one of the things we're thinking about with making this PPE major is like, man, if we could just because the kids love I mean, business school students are great, they're just different, right? But they get really excited about having right? And so if we can like channel them and like, okay, come take a 10 class second major in PPE, I mean, that's the dream, right? Everyone wins, right? They get their finance degree, we get a PPE degree, they leave with both concrete skill, but also being more worldly. Like it's just win-win-win all around. So absolutely, you see excitement for other stuff on campus, and we're actively building opportunities to try and further capture some of that demand.
well, that's great to hear because one of our convictions at Teagle is that if you get a cornerstone type program going, it has good effects beyond itself. It generates interest in among students in taking more courses in philosophy, literature, history, and so on. And you know, the humanities, as you know, can use all the help they can get. I think Cornerstone is one of the most obvious,
100%.
most obvious therapies that we can offer.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,